The cold millionaire CEO opened his eyes. The scan revealed why her ID was stolen. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. The first sound was not pain, not fear, but a steady electronic rhythm, a soft beep that counted time inside a room washed in pale white light, where Ethan Caldwell had not opened his eyes in days. A man known across Manhattan boardrooms as cold, precise, and unreachable. A self-made millionaire whose name sat on glass towers and quarterly reports, now lying perfectly still as machines breathed with him. While just a few feet away stood Lily Harper, her shoes worn thin, her badge reading temporary caregiver, her hands careful as she adjusted a blanket she did not own for a man she did not know. And yet the moment carried weight, because something about this night was different, the air heavier, the silence more attentive, as if the room itself were waiting. Ethan's life had always moved at 60 miles per hour, measured in earnings calls, flights, and contracts, never in heartbeats. But here, time slowed to inches and seconds, and Lily felt it as she checked his pulse with the gentle pressure she used every night, a habit born from necessity and kindness rather than training alone, whispering small updates no one asked for, the weather outside, the hum of traffic on Fifth Avenue, the way the city never truly slept, believing, or maybe hoping, that, somewhere behind closed eyes, he could hear. Then it happened, the hook no one expected, a faint change on the monitor, subtle enough to miss. But Lily didn't, because she had learned to notice small things in a life where small things mattered, the slightest shift in rhythm, the tiniest pause between beeps, and she froze, breath held, as Ethan's fingers twitched, not dramatically, not suddenly, but just enough to say this was no coincidence. Doctors would later argue probabilities and charts, but Lily felt it first, the moment the cold so responded not to medicine, not to machines, but to presence, to care, to a voice that carried no agenda. And when Ethan's eyes finally opened, slow and unfocused, the room seemed to inhale with him, his gaze landing not on the lights, not on the ceiling, but on Lily, the poor girl standing at his side, whose name was already tangled in a mystery she did not yet understand. Because hours earlier, unseen hands had been moving through files and systems, copying her ID, bending her identity into a shadow she would soon have to face. And the scans that saved Ethan would be the same scans that exposed why someone needed her name, her records, her existence, all while the city outside kept moving, unaware that in a quiet hospital room measured in feet and heartbeats, two lives had just collided, and nothing about either of them would ever be the same again. Lily Harper did not sleep that morning, not after what she had seen, not after the moment Ethan Caldwell's eyes opened and settled on her, as if she were the only solid thing in a room built of light and machines. Because while doctors came and went and monitors continued their steady rhythm, Lily remained where she always stood, close enough to help, far enough to not be noticed, telling herself this was just another shift, another patient, even as her hands trembled slightly when she finally stepped out into the hallway just before sunrise. She leaned against the cool wall, counting her breaths, reminding herself that she was not part of his world, that men like Ethan Caldwell lived in penthouses measured in square feet and skyline views, not in borrowed scrubs and bus schedules timed down to the minute. Yet the truth pressed on her chest as heavily as the fatigue in her legs, because she had been the one there when he responded. She had been the one speaking when his fingers moved, and somewhere deep inside, she knew that mattered. Lily's life had always been a careful balancing act, measured in dollars and hours, in how far a gallon of gas could stretch and how many miles she could walk if she had to, her mornings starting before the sun and ending long after it set, sharing a small room in a run-down apartment where the heater rattled louder than it warmed, her identity reduced to a temporary badge because her real documents were locked in a process she did not fully understand, stalled by missing records and unanswered emails, making her invisible on paper even as she worked tirelessly in real life. That was why she had taken this assignment, the overnight care no one wanted, the man everyone whispered about, because it paid a few dollars more per hour and did not ask too many questions, and because somewhere along the way, caring for people who could not speak back had become the one place she felt steady. Inside the hospital room, Ethan drifted between awareness and rest, his mind fogged but his senses oddly sharp, aware of voices, of the soft cadence of Lily's words, though he did not yet know her name. Only that when she spoke, the tightness in his chest eased, and when she was silent, something fell off, like a missing note in a song he could not quite remember. Doctors ran standard follow-up scans, calm and methodical, noting responses that surprised them, but explaining nothing yet, while Lily watched from the doorway, her badge catching the fluorescent light, her reflection briefly overlapping with Ethan's on the glass. Two lives aligned for a moment before drifting apart again. She told herself she would finish her shift and disappear, just like always, because that was safer, because she had learned not to stay where she was not meant to be. But as she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with an automated message from an agency she had been waiting on for months, informing her that there was an issue with her identification, that her records did not match, that someone else was using her information somewhere in the system. Lily stared at the screen, her stomach tightening, unaware that the same scans being reviewed inside the room behind her would soon reveal patterns that tied her existence to Ethan's survival in ways neither of them could have imagined. And as she slipped her phone back into her pocket and took one last look toward the room where the cold CO rested, she made a quiet decision to stay just a little longer, not knowing that choice would pull her into a story far larger than either of them. One that would test identity, trust, and the meaning of healing itself. Lily Harper settled into a rhythm over the next several days, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but built quietly through repetition, arriving before dawn with a paper cup of coffee that tasted more like habit than comfort, checking Ethan Caldwell's vitals in the same order every time, adjusting the blinds just enough to let in the morning light without glare, and speaking to him in a calm, even tone that never rushed, because somewhere in her life she had learned that consistency could be a form of care. She told him simple things, never secrets, never confessions, just fragments of the world outside his room, how the temperature dropped overnight, how traffic along the avenue had eased after a holiday weekend, how a delivery truck had blocked the entrance for 10 minutes and made everyone late, believing that if he was listening, these ordinary details might tether him to waking life better than any dramatic plea. Ethan remained mostly quiet, drifting in and out, but his body responded in ways that charts could not fully explain, his heart rate steadying when Lily was near, his breathing smoothing as her voice filled the space, subtle changes that registered as small victories only to someone who had learned to look closely. Doctors noted improvement without attributing it to any one factor, crediting rest, medication, time, while Lily continued the routine without expectation, washing his hands with warm cloths, repositioning pillows, placing her fingers lightly at his wrist each time she checked his pulse, a touch brief and professional, yet grounding, the same way she checked on every patient, because routine was the one thing she could control. Outside the room, Ethan's name carried weight, whispered by staff who knew his company funded research wings and scholarships, who speculated quietly about his future and the decisions waiting for him once he recovered. But inside the room, stripped of titles and tailored suits, he was just a man learning how to be present again, aware of the sensation of air filling his lungs, of light shifting across the ceiling, of a presence he could not yet place, but somehow trusted. Lily noticed the first time his eyes followed her across the room, not sharply, not fully focused, but enough to tell her he was aware, and she did not comment, did not react, only continued what she was doing, because she knew how easily moments could be lost if you tried to name them too soon. At the end of each shift, she hesitated before leaving, standing at the doorway for an extra second, as if making sure the room remembered her, while her phone buzzed again with reminders about her unresolved identification issues, notices that her records were under review, that responses would be delayed, messages that followed her like a shadow she could not shake. She had learned to live with uncertainty, to move forward even when systems stalled, but standing there, looking at Ethan, she felt an unfamiliar pull, the sense that staying mattered, that her presence was not interchangeable, even if no one else noticed yet. On the fourth morning, A nurse mentioned casually that Ethan's scans were scheduled again. Routine follow-up to measure cognitive response, and Lily nodded, filing the information away without realizing how tightly that word would soon bind her to him. As she finished her tasks, Ethan stirred slightly, his gaze finding her face more clearly than before, and for the first time, his lips moved, forming a sound that barely carried. But Lily leaned in instinctively, listening, her heart steady despite the moment, because she had learned that healing did not arrive all at once. It came in inches, in repeated actions, in showing up again and again. And as she straightened and continued her work, she did not know that this routine she treated as ordinary had already become the key to everything that would follow. Lily Harper noticed the change before anyone said a word, because by now she could read the room the way some people read faces, by the way footsteps slowed outside the door, by the slight pause in conversation when doctors glanced at charts a second longer than usual, and by the way Ethan Caldwell's breathing shifted whenever she stood beside him, steady and even as long as her voice filled the space. The morning of the scheduled scans arrived quietly, without drama, sunlight filtering through the blinds as technicians prepared equipment and explained procedures in calm, professional tones, treating Ethan like any other patient despite the weight his name carried beyond these walls. Lily stepped back as protocol required, folding her hands together, watching from the side as images formed on screens she could not interpret, patterns of light and shadow mapping a mind still finding its way back. What unsettled her was not the process but the result, because when the room cleared and the doctors reviewed the data, she saw it in their expressions, a flicker of confusion quickly masked by clinical neutrality, a brief exchange of glances that said something did not fit neatly into expectation. Later, as Lily resumed her routine, one of the nurses mentioned casually that Ethan's responses were inconsistent, stronger during certain hours, calmer under specific conditions, and Lily did not have to ask which conditions those were, because she already knew. Over the next day, the pattern became harder to ignore, his heart rate settling when she spoke, his focus sharpening when she stood within arm's reach, small reactions that repeated themselves with such precision they began to feel intentional, as if his body recognized something his mind had not yet sorted through. A neurologist requested additional imaging, phrasing it carefully, saying they wanted to rule out variables, to understand environmental influence, and Lily nodded, even as a quiet unease crept in, because variables, she had learned, often became people when systems needed explanations. Ethan, more awake now, sensed the shift without understanding it fully, aware that conversations paused when he entered them, that eyes moved from him to Lily and back again, and though he could not recall details of his past, he recognized discomfort when he saw it. When Lily spoke, he listened, not just to the words but to the steadiness behind them, the absence of expectation, and when she left the room briefly to retrieve supplies, he noticed the difference immediately, the room feeling larger, less anchored, until she returned and something inside him settled again. The doctors discussed possibilities in careful language, neural pathways responding to familiar stimuli, subconscious recognition, emotional memory, but none of it explained why his scans showed activation spikes that correlated so closely with Lily's presence, or why those same scans revealed anomalies tied to administrative records rather than biology. It was during a late afternoon review that a quiet question surfaced, not spoken aloud in front of patients, but exchanged between professionals trained to notice inconsistencies, a question about identification tags, about records attached to Lily Harper's name, because something in the system did not align with what the scans suggested. Lily felt the weight of it when she was asked, politely, to confirm her information again, her full name, date of birth, previous employment, questions she had answered many times before, always with the same calm honesty, though each repetition reminded her how fragile her footing was. She answered clearly, offering documentation she carried copies of, worn at the edges from use. Watching as the administrator typed, paused, then typed again, her expression neutral but intent. That night, alone in the room with Ethan, Lily spoke as she always did, her voice steady, describing the rain that had started outside, how it tapped against the windows in uneven rhythm, and Ethan listened, aware that whatever questions were forming beyond the door, they did not belong in this moment. Yet as Lily rested her fingers lightly against his wrist, the same gentle check she had performed dozens of times before, a monitor nearby registered another clear response, a confirmation that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Somewhere in the hospital, data compiled quietly, patterns emerging that pointed toward a connection no one had anticipated, linking recovery to presence and presence to identity. And as Lily finished her shift and gathered her things, she sensed, without fully understanding why, that the scans meant to protect Ethan's future were beginning to circle her own life in ways she could not yet escape. Lily Harper was adjusting the chair beside the bed when she felt it, not through sight or sound, but through a sudden stillness in the room, the kind that presses gently against the skin. And when she looked up, Ethan Caldwell was no longer drifting, his eyes open and clear in a way they had not been before, focused not on the ceiling or the light, but directly on her face, as if the fog that had separated them finally thinned enough to let him see her fully. She froze, heart steady but alert, reminding herself to breathe, to stay calm, because moments like this could vanish if handled with too much urgency. Yet before she could speak, his fingers moved again, this time not a twitch but a deliberate reach, slow and uncertain, until they brushed against the back of her hand where it rested near his wrist. The contact was light, professional boundaries intact, but the intention behind it was unmistakable, and Lily responded the only way she knew how, by staying present, by gently placing her hand where his had landed, grounding the moment instead of claiming it. Ethan's breath deepened, his gaze steady, and though his voice had not yet formed words, his awareness was undeniable, a quiet return rather than a dramatic arrival. And when Lily spoke his name, calmly, clearly, the sound seemed to anchor him further, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration, as if testing the reality of this new connection. Medical staff were alerted, arriving with composed efficiency, checking responses, asking simple questions, measuring progress in ways that fit their training, while Lily stepped back just enough to give them space without leaving the room entirely, watching as Ethan answered with nods, with subtle movements, his focus returning to her each time the room settled. The doctors noted the improvement with careful optimism, describing it as a positive turn, a meaningful step forward, but what they did not say aloud was how consistently his responsiveness aligned with Lily's presence, how when she spoke, his attention sharpened, and when she moved out of view, his expression dimmed slightly, not distressed, just less engaged. Ethan, still sorting through sensation and memory, understood only fragments, the feel of fabric beneath his fingers, the sound of Lily's voice, the sense that something essential had brought him back from the edge, and though he could not yet name it, he trusted it instinctively, the way a person trusts the ground beneath their feet without needing to see its foundation. As the room quieted again and visitors were limited, Lily resumed her familiar position at his side, speaking softly, telling him he had done well, that rest was important, that everything else could wait, her tone steady and reassuring, offering no promises beyond what she could give. Ethan listened, absorbing not just the words but the calm behind them, and for the first time since waking, his lips moved with purpose, forming a sound that carried more meaning than volume, a single word shaped slowly, carefully, as if he were testing language itself. Lily leaned in, close enough to hear without crossing into urgency, and when he spoke her name, imperfectly but unmistakably, her chest tightened just slightly, not with fear or surprise, but with recognition, the understanding that whatever connection the scans were beginning to suggest had already existed on a human level long before data confirmed it. Outside the room, updates traveled quickly, administrators taking note of the milestone, plans adjusting, conversations shifting, but inside, the focus remained simple, a man reclaiming awareness and a woman continuing the routine that had carried him there. Lily did not yet know how deeply this moment would alter her path, how the same awakening celebrated by the hospital would soon draw scrutiny toward her own identity. But as she stayed with Ethan while the day faded into evening, she sensed that the quiet miracle unfolding between steady beeps and measured breaths was only the beginning of something far more complicated and far more personal than either of them had anticipated. The days that followed unfolded with a careful slowness, measured not by calendars, but by small gains, by how long Ethan Caldwell could keep his eyes open without strain, by how clearly he could follow a conversation, by how his attention seemed to anchor itself whenever Lily Harper entered the room, as if her presence gave shape to thoughts still drifting without edges. Physical recovery progressed according to expectation, strength returning inch by inch, but memory moved differently, uneven and selective, leaving gaps that frustrated doctors and unsettled Ethan himself, because while he could recall numbers, timelines, and abstract facts with startling clarity, personal moments remained elusive, faces without names, events without emotional weight, except for one constant: the certainty that Lily mattered. He did not remember meeting her, did not remember how long she had been there, but he remembered the feeling of safety that came when she spoke, the way her voice seemed to steady the noise in his head, and when he asked simple questions, she answered honestly, without filling the silence with speculation. Lily adjusted her routine as his awareness grew, encouraging him gently, helping him sit up, guiding him through small exercises prescribed by therapists, always careful to maintain the same calm tone she had used when he could not respond at all, because she understood that familiarity could be as healing as progress. Ethan noticed how she never rushed him, how she waited for him to find words instead of supplying them, and that patience built trust faster than reassurance ever could. Outside the room, discussions continued about his future, about leadership, about responsibilities waiting beyond recovery. But inside, the world narrowed to manageable pieces, a glass of water lifted slowly, a short walk measured in steps rather than distance, a conversation that stayed grounded in the present. Lily became, without announcement, the constant reference point, the person Ethan looked toward when asked how he felt, not because she answered for him, but because her presence reminded him that it was acceptable to take time. At night, when the hospital quieted, Ethan lay awake thinking, aware of what he did not remember, aware that something significant had happened to bring him here, and yet unable to access it fully. And in those moments, uncertainty pressed in, a rare feeling for a man who had built his life on control. Lily sensed this too, noticing the tension in his posture, the way his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, and she responded not with explanations but with steadiness, sitting nearby, describing the present moment, grounding him in what was real and known. Meanwhile, administrative inquiries continued quietly, requests for confirmation, cross-checks, reviews that brushed against Lily's unresolved identification issues, and though no one accused her outright, the weight of being observed settled in, making her more aware of every movement, every word. She told herself to focus on the work, on the patient, on the routine that had carried them this far, even as unease followed her home, lingering in the small room she rented, where documents lay spread across the table, reminders of how fragile her footing remained. Ethan noticed changes too, subtle shifts in Lily's demeanor, a brief hesitation before answering questions not about him but about herself. And though his memory lacked detail, his instincts remained sharp, telling him that she was carrying something alone. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted across the floor, Ethan spoke more clearly than before, telling her that when she was near, the confusion eased, that even without memory, he felt oriented, and Lily listened, acknowledging his words without letting them become more than they were, because she understood the difference between gratitude born of healing and something deeper that needed time to form. Still, the bond between them strengthened quietly, built on shared hours and mutual respect, even as unseen forces continued to align beyond the room, drawing connections between recovery, data, and identity that would soon demand answers neither of them was fully prepared to face. The shift in atmosphere came quietly, carried in by visitors who did not wear scrubs and whose presence altered the rhythm of the floor without raising their voices, and Lily Harper felt. At the moment she stepped aside to let a tall man in a tailored suit pass, his posture confident, his gaze scanning the corridor as if it belonged to him, because people like that moved differently, not hurried, not uncertain, but assured. Ethan Caldwell noticed too, a flicker of recognition crossing his face that did not resolve into memory but into instinct, a sense of familiarity that brought with it tension rather than comfort. And when the man entered the room, introducing himself as Marcus Caldwell, a relative and business partner, the air tightened in a way Lily could not name, but immediately respected. Marcus spoke smoothly, asking after Ethan's recovery with the practiced concern of someone accustomed to being heard, referencing board updates and schedules as if they were distant but waiting. And though Ethan listened politely, his attention drifted back to Lily repeatedly, grounding himself in her presence as conversations edged toward topics he was not ready to reclaim. Lily remained professional, offering space, maintaining distance, yet she felt observed, Marcus's eyes resting on her badge a moment longer than necessary, his expression unreadable, as if cataloging details for later use. After he left, the room seemed to exhale, Ethan's shoulders easing slightly, and he admitted quietly that the visit had stirred something unsettled, not memory but pressure, and Lily acknowledged it without probing, reminding him that healing did not require answers all at once. Over the next days, more visitors followed, assistants, advisors, people whose lives intersected with Ethan's through contracts and expectations rather than care, and each time, Lily noticed how his focus wavered until she returned to her usual place, how his breathing steadied when routine resumed. Meanwhile, administrative reviews intensified, polite inquiries giving way to more structured requests, meetings scheduled to verify credentials, to clarify discrepancies that could no longer be overlooked, and Lily found herself summoned to an office where calm voices explained that her identification records appeared in multiple systems in ways that did not align, that someone had accessed and replicated her information for reasons still under review. Lily listened carefully, answering what she could, presenting documents she carried everywhere now, her hands steady despite the knot forming in her chest, because she had learned long ago that panic only fed suspicion. She was told not to worry, that these things happened, yet the word review echoed uncomfortably, following her back. Down the hallway where she paused outside Ethan's room, centering herself before re-entering. Ethan sensed the change immediately, noting the tension Lily worked to conceal, and though he did not press, he made a simple request, asking her to stay for a moment, to sit nearby while he gathered his thoughts, and Lily complied, recognizing the same need she had felt in herself so many times before. As days passed, Ethan's clarity increased, his ability to engage strengthening even as the gaps in his memory remained stubborn, particularly around the time leading up to his hospitalization, and doctors spoke of selective amnesia, of emotional blocks that might lift gradually or not at all, explanations that comforted without resolving the deeper unease. Marcus returned once more, this time less formal, more intent, asking pointed questions about Ethan's care, about progress, about Lily's role, and though his tone remained polite, Lily felt the scrutiny sharpen, the sense that she had become part of a larger equation she did not understand. Afterward, Ethan expressed discomfort, admitting that something about Marcus's interest did not sit right, that while he could not recall specific betrayals, his instincts warned him to be cautious, and Lily listened, validating his feelings without amplifying fear. Outside, data continued to compile, scans reviewed alongside access logs and administrative timestamps, revealing overlaps that suggested planning rather than error, and though Lily did not yet see the full picture, she felt the walls narrowing, her life intersecting with Ethan's not just emotionally, but systemically. Still, within the room, they maintained the rhythm that had brought them this far, shared silence, measured steps, honest conversation, because whatever questions loomed beyond the door, the space they shared remained defined by care rather than control, even as the truth, layered and complex, edged closer to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. Lily Harper became aware that the questions were no longer theoretical when she was asked to wait after her shift, the request delivered politely but firmly, and she followed the administrator down a quiet hallway into a glass-walled office where a small recorder sat on the table beside a neat stack of papers bearing her name. The conversation remained calm, professional, framed as clarification rather than accusation, yet the substance carried weight, because the review had advanced beyond mismatched entries and into timelines, access logs, and duplicated identifiers that intersected with Ethan Caldwell's. Admission and care. Lily answered steadily, recounting her work history, the delays in her documentation, the steps she had taken to resolve them, careful not to speculate, careful not to defend more than the facts allowed, because she understood how easily intention could be misread when systems searched for patterns. She was told that additional verification would be required, that she might be placed on temporary leave until the matter was resolved, and she nodded, accepting the words even as they landed heavily, knowing what time off meant for someone living paycheck to paycheck. When she returned to Ethan's room to gather her things, he noticed immediately the quiet resolve in her posture, the way she moved with deliberation, and though he did not know the details, he sensed a shift that concerned him more than any medical uncertainty. Lily explained only what she could, that there were questions about her records, that it was routine, that she might be away briefly, keeping her tone light, but Ethan heard the restraint beneath it and felt an unfamiliar urgency rise. He asked to speak with the physician overseeing his care, and when they arrived, he listened carefully, absorbing explanations about compliance and process, then stated simply that Lily's presence had been a constant in his recovery, that her role mattered, that removing her without cause did not align with the evidence of his progress. The room fell quiet, the doctor acknowledging his perspective without committing, because decisions lived at the intersection of care and policy, not preference. That evening, Ethan requested copies of his recent scans and summaries, something he had not done before, and as he reviewed them with effort and focus, he noticed annotations correlating responsiveness with environmental factors, timing, presence, patterns that mirrored what he felt instinctively. He asked questions, precise ones, about how data was weighted, about administrative overlays, about whether identity records could influence access and interpretation, and while answers remained measured, a line of inquiry opened that could not easily be closed. Lily, meanwhile, returned to her small room with a stack of documents spread across the table, comparing dates and names, noticing for the first time how often her information appeared adjacent to systems she had never used, permissions she had never requested, and the realization settled in that someone had not merely copied her identification, they had threaded it through places designed to obscure responsibility. The thought frightened her not because of what it implied about guilt, but because of how little control she had ever possessed over the paper version of herself. The next morning, she arrived early, determined to maintain routine until told otherwise, and Ethan greeted her with clearer eyes and a quiet resolve that matched her own. He did not promise outcomes, did not assert authority, but he told her that he would not ignore evidence, that he would ask the questions that mattered, and that whatever the system concluded, he would insist on transparency. Lily listened, appreciating the steadiness without mistaking it for protection, because she had learned the cost of relying on assurances. As the day progressed, requests were made, data pulled, meetings scheduled, and the hospital's neutral corridors carried the subtle hum of investigation. While in the room, Lily continued the work she had always done, checking vitals, encouraging rest, speaking calmly, grounding Ethan as he navigated both recovery and uncertainty. By late afternoon, a preliminary finding circulated quietly among administrators, noting that access tied to Lily's identity coincided with a narrow window before Ethan's admission, a coincidence too precise to dismiss, and though no conclusions were drawn yet, the direction was clear. Lily felt the pressure of it as she prepared to leave, the sense that her presence had become both essential and risky, and she stood at the doorway a moment longer than usual, committing the room to memory, because she did not know when she would be allowed back. Ethan watched her go, aware that the same systems measuring his healing were now entangling her future, and he resolved, with the clarity he had reclaimed inch by inch, that recovery would not be complete unless the truth surfaced fully for both of them. Ethan Caldwell requested a meeting the next morning, not with administrators alone, but with clinical leadership present, his tone measured and deliberate, the way it had always been in boardrooms, because while his body was still recovering, his ability to reason and decide had returned with clarity that surprised even him. Lily Harper was not in the room when the conversation began, having been informed that her schedule was on hold pending review, and the absence felt heavier than he expected, sharpening his resolve rather than softening it. He listened as procedures were outlined again, as compliance language framed uncertainty, as caution, and when it was his turn to speak, he did not argue emotion or attachment. He spoke in terms the system understood, evidence, correlation, impact, noting that his recovery data showed consistent improvement aligned with Lily's presence, that removing her, without substantiated cause risked patient outcomes, and that any investigation claiming to protect integrity should not undermine documented care. The room shifted subtly, professionals exchanging looks as they considered the implications, because while policy carried weight, outcomes carried accountability, and Ethan's insistence was grounded not in privilege but in observable fact. He asked direct questions about the duplicated identity findings, about timelines, about who benefited from the overlap between Lily's records and restricted access points. And the answers, though cautious, revealed enough to confirm his concern that Lily's identity had been used as a conduit rather than a source, a shield rather than an origin. Ethan requested that Lily not be treated as a suspect without cause, that her access be reinstated under supervision if necessary, and that the investigation expand outward instead of narrowing inward, a reframing that forced consideration of alternative narratives. Later that day, he asked to see Lily, and when she entered the room, uncertain but composed, he told her plainly what he had done, not as a promise of protection but as a statement of principle, that evidence mattered, that fairness mattered, and that he would not allow convenience to dictate blame. Lily listened quietly, absorbing the relief and the risk intertwined in his words, because she understood that standing beside someone with his influence drew attention as much as it offered support. She thanked him without sentimentality, acknowledging the effort while maintaining her own footing, and returned to her routine with renewed focus, aware that the scrutiny had not disappeared, only shifted direction. Over the next days, the investigation broadened, access logs reviewed across departments, permissions traced back to points of authorization that did not align with Lily's role, and while no conclusions were announced, the tone changed, suspicion giving way to analysis. Ethan continued his recovery with determination, participating fully in therapy, pushing gently but consistently, his confidence rebuilding not through dominance, but through choice. And Lily remained present where allowed, providing care with the same steadiness she always had, neither withdrawing nor asserting herself beyond her role. Marcus Caldwell's name surfaced more frequently in quiet conversations, not as an accusation, but as a question, his proximity to systems and decisions raising considerations that had previously gone unspoken, and when he visited again, his demeanor was polite but guarded, his interest more calculated, and Ethan noted it with clarity that left little room for doubt. One afternoon, as Lily assisted Ethan through a short walk measured in careful steps, he paused, steadying himself, and told her that regardless of how the investigation resolved, he wanted her to know that her integrity had already been demonstrated through action, through consistency, through care given when no one was watching. Lily met his gaze, acknowledging the sentiment without allowing it to become something else, because she understood the importance of boundaries, even as trust grew between them. As the day ended and Lily prepared to leave, she felt the weight on her shoulders shift slightly, not lifted entirely but redistributed, shared now by someone willing to confront complexity rather than simplify it. Ethan watched her go with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with responsibility, aware that choosing to stand beside her had altered the trajectory of both their lives, not through grand gestures, but through a commitment to truth that neither of them was willing to abandon. Evidence began to align with a clarity that no longer allowed polite ambiguity, and Ethan Caldwell felt it as meetings grew more precise, less cautious, the questions sharper, the timelines tighter, because patterns once dismissed as coincidence now repeated with intent, access permissions linked to narrow windows, approvals routed through familiar channels, and the duplicated identity trail leading away from Lily Harper rather than toward her. He reviewed summaries late into the evening, eyes steady, noting how her records appeared as a pass-through layer rather than a destination, a borrowed signature placed where accountability needed to disappear, and the realization settled without drama, because it matched the unease his instincts had flagged since the first visit from Marcus Caldwell. Lily continued her work under supervision, maintaining the same rhythm, the same composure, even as whispers softened and the tone of oversight shifted from suspicion to protection, and though relief flickered briefly, she kept her focus narrow, understanding that clarity came only when truth was named openly. The turning point arrived during a joint review convened with clinical leadership and compliance present, when an analyst presented a simple visual, access nodes mapped against time, identity overlays highlighted, and the room grew quiet as the overlap resolved into a single corridor of authorization that traced back to executive privileges adjacent to Marcus's purview. No accusation was spoken at first, only questions asked in sequence: who approved the temporary access, who benefited from the delay in detection, who stood to gain control during a period of uncertainty, and Ethan listened without interruption, allowing the structure of the facts to speak before he did. When he finally addressed the room, his voice remained level, stating that the evidence suggested orchestration rather than error, that Lily's identity had been used to mask a pathway designed to evade scrutiny during a vulnerable window, and that accountability required expanding the inquiry to those with motive and reach. The response was careful but decisive, next steps outlined, safeguards enacted, and Lily was formally cleared of wrongdoing pending final confirmation, a statement delivered plainly, without apology, but with consequence. Ethan asked to speak with Marcus privately afterward, not as a confrontation staged for effect, but as a necessity for closure, and the meeting took place in a neutral room where glass reflected light evenly, leaving nowhere for shadows to linger. Marcus arrived composed, offering explanations that leaned on complexity and timing, suggesting misunderstandings, but Ethan did not debate theory. He asked about specifics, dates, signatures, and when answers thinned, silence filled the space with weight. He stated, without raising his voice, that the investigation would proceed independently, that any attempt to redirect responsibility through Lily's identity had failed, and that trust once broken did not repair through persuasion. Marcus listened, nodding, the mask of confidence slipping just enough to confirm what the data already had, and the meeting ended without spectacle because the truth did not require it. Later, when Ethan told Lily the outcome, he did so plainly, acknowledging the relief without embellishment, affirming that her name had been cleared and that the system had corrected its aim, and Lily received the news quietly, letting the tension ease in her shoulders, understanding that resolution did not erase the strain it took to get there. That evening, as Ethan completed another measured walk, steps counted not by distance but by steadiness, he reflected on how recovery had taught him a different kind of leadership, one that valued patience over pressure, evidence over assumption, and presence over control. Lily remained beside him, attentive but unassuming, continuing the care that had carried him through uncertainty, and in the quiet between tasks, a shared understanding settled, that the path forward would not be simple, but it would be honest. Outside the room, processes continued, reports finalized, protections enforced, and while the larger implications would unfold in time, within the space they shared, the immediate truth had surfaced, not through force or fear, but through persistence, integrity, and the willingness to follow facts wherever they led, even when they pointed uncomfortably close to home. The hospital felt different once the findings were finalized, not louder or quieter, but steadier, as if a low hum of uncertainty had finally resolved into a single clear tone, and Lily Harper sensed it the moment she walked onto the floor without being stopped, questioned, or redirected, her badge scanned and accepted without pause. Word traveled quickly in subtle ways, through softened glances, through a nod from compliance staff who now met her eyes, and though no one offered apologies, the shift itself spoke clearly enough. Ethan Caldwell continued his recovery with renewed focus, his movement stronger, his balance improving, and for the first time since waking, he spoke openly about leaving the hospital, not as an escape, but as a transition he felt ready to make. Lily supported the process with the same care she always had, reviewing instructions, reinforcing routines, ensuring continuity, because healing, she knew, did not end at discharge, it simply changed location. One afternoon, as sunlight filled the room and Ethan completed a final assessment, a senior physician remarked on the progress, noting how consistency and support had played an undeniable role, and though the comment was clinical, its meaning lingered. Afterward, Ethan asked Lily to sit with him, not for treatment, but to talk, and he acknowledged plainly that his recovery had reshaped his understanding of leadership, that power without awareness had once defined his decisions, but vulnerability had taught him something he could not have learned otherwise. Lily listened without interruption, appreciating the honesty while maintaining the balance she had always kept, because she understood that clarity did not require agreement, only respect. As preparations for discharge continued, administrative representatives met with Ethan to discuss next steps, safeguards, and the separation of roles. And during one such meeting, he made a quiet but deliberate request that Lily be offered a permanent position within the recovery program or affiliated care network, not as a favor, but as recognition of demonstrated competence and integrity. The request was reviewed carefully, framed appropriately, and approved without fanfare, a decision grounded in documented outcomes rather than sentiment. Lily received the offer with measured gratitude, understanding what it represented not just professionally, but personally, a stability she had worked toward for years, earned through consistency rather than chance. When she shared the news with Ethan, she did so plainly, thanking him without elevating him beyond his role in the process, and he accepted her response with the same respect, acknowledging that support meant more when it did not demand obligation. As days passed, Ethan's room emptied of equipment, the steady beeps replaced by ordinary silence, and Lily noticed how the absence felt strange after so long, a reminder of how environments shape experience. On his final day, Ethan stood unaided, dressed in clothes that felt unfamiliar after weeks of hospital fabric, and though his posture carried confidence, there was a quiet humility in the way he thanked staff individually, recognizing contributions often overlooked. When it was time for him to leave, Lily walked him partway down the hall, stopping at the point where professional boundaries naturally resumed, and they paused, neither rushing the moment nor extending it unnecessarily. Ethan told her that whatever came next, he intended to carry forward what he had learned, to ask better questions, to listen more closely, and to remember that recovery was not a solitary achievement. Lily responded simply, wishing him well, reminding him to pace himself, because healing, she said, was not about speed, but about direction. As she watched him exit, surrounded by advisors, yet moving independently, Lily felt a quiet satisfaction settle in, not triumph, not relief alone, but the deeper sense of alignment that comes from having stood firm through uncertainty without losing oneself. The chapter that had bound them so closely was ending, but its impact remained, shaping paths that would continue forward separately, yet informed by the same hard-won clarity. And as Lily returned to her work, grounded and assured, she understood that what had begun as routine care had become something enduring, a testament to how integrity and presence could alter outcomes far beyond their immediate reach. Time passed in ways that felt quieter than before, marked not by machines or schedules, but by choices made deliberately. And Lily Harper felt the shift as she settled into her new role, steady hours replacing uncertainty, familiar corridors now carrying a sense of belonging earned rather than borrowed. Ethan Caldwell re-entered his life with equal intention, returning to work selectively, restructuring priorities, and building space for recovery not as an afterthought, but as a foundation, because what he had learned in the hospital stayed with him, shaping how he listened, how he decided, how he showed up. They did not rush toward each other, did not blur boundaries out of gratitude or momentum, instead allowing trust to grow through ordinary contact, brief conversations after rounds, shared updates about progress and plans, moments that carried weight because they were unforced. Weeks later, on a clear afternoon when sunlight softened the city rather than glaring off glass, Ethan asked Lily to meet him at the hospital courtyard, a place she knew well from short breaks, where benches faced a small garden maintained by volunteers who understood the value of quiet spaces. She arrived expecting conversation, perhaps closure, and found him standing with an ease that spoke to regained strength, holding something small in his hand, not a spectacle, not an announcement, but an object that carried memory. He told her that during his recovery, there was one item he had asked to keep, the hospital bracelet that marked the days when his world had narrowed to breath and presence, when healing had been measured in inches and minutes. And he explained that he had kept it not as a reminder of vulnerability, but as proof of what consistency and care could rebuild. Lily listened, recognizing the significance without anticipation, because she had learned to let moments define themselves. Ethan spoke plainly, saying that he did not believe in grand gestures untethered from action, that what he wanted to offer was not rescue or elevation, but partnership grounded in respect, growth, and shared purpose. He acknowledged the imbalance that had once defined their positions, the systems that had nearly failed her, and stated clearly that any step forward would be taken only with her consent, her agency intact. Then he asked, without urgency, without pressure, if she would consider building a life together at a pace that honored what they had learned, and as he did, he placed the bracelet gently between them, not as a token of ownership, but as a symbol of beginnings shaped by care rather than control. Lily took a moment before responding, feeling the weight of the choice not as fear, but as responsibility, because she understood the difference between gratitude and commitment, and she wanted the latter to be chosen freely. She told him that what had drawn her to him was not his recovery alone, but his willingness to listen when it mattered, to stand by truth even when it complicated his world, and that she believed relationships, like healing, required patience, honesty, and the courage to remain present when answers were incomplete. She accepted his offer not as a promise of certainty, but as an agreement to move forward thoughtfully, to protect what they had built through consistency rather than spectacle. The moment remained quiet, the city continuing beyond the courtyard, birds settling in the trees, life unfolding at its own pace, and neither of them rushed to define what came next, because the meaning was already clear. In the days that followed, they navigated the shift together, setting boundaries, aligning schedules, integrating their lives without erasing what made each of them whole. And Lily noticed how often Ethan deferred rather than directed, how his leadership now included space for others to speak. The bracelet found a place in a small box alongside other keepsakes, not displayed, but remembered, and whenever challenges surfaced, they returned to the practices that had sustained them before: steady communication, respect for process, and trust built through action. As seasons changed, the hospital courtyard remained a point of return, a place where they could pause and recalibrate, reminding themselves that what had begun in a room defined by beeps and silence had evolved into something rooted and real. And in choosing each other without haste or illusion, they affirmed that healing was not merely the absence of illness, but the presence of connection grounded in integrity, a lesson they carried forward together, shaping a future neither had expected, but both were prepared to build. The years that followed did not announce themselves with headlines or sudden turns, but with a steady accumulation of moments that proved how deeply both Ethan Caldwell and Lily Harper had changed, because what they carried forward from that hospital room was not drama, but discipline, not spectacle, but choice. Ethan reshaped his leadership in ways that surprised those who thought recovery would soften his edge, because it sharpened something else instead: his attention, his patience, his willingness to listen before deciding, and under his direction, systems once designed to obscure accountability were restructured to protect people rather than power. Lily continued her work with the same quiet dedication that had first anchored him, expanding her role into mentorship, helping new caregivers understand that consistency was not routine, it was trust built minute by minute, and her presence became known not for proximity to influence, but for reliability that did not waver under pressure. Together, they built a life that honored both independence and partnership, setting rhythms that supported growth rather than urgency, shared mornings measured in conversation rather than schedules, evenings grounded in reflection rather than noise, and when challenges arose, as they always do, they returned to the practices that had sustained them from the beginning: honesty, restraint, and the courage to face complexity without retreat. The hospital courtyard remained a place they visited occasionally, not out of nostalgia, but gratitude, a reminder of where clarity had first emerged, and each time they passed through, Lily would pause, noticing how the garden changed with the seasons, how care, when applied consistently, reshaped even the smallest spaces. Ethan often spoke publicly about recovery, not in terms of personal triumph, but systemic responsibility, emphasizing that healing did not happen in isolation, that outcomes improved when integrity guided process, and his words carried weight because they were backed by action rather than performance. Lily remained selective about visibility, choosing impact over recognition, content to know that her work mattered even when it was unseen, because she had learned long ago that presence did not require applause. On an ordinary evening, years after the investigation had closed and the memory of uncertainty had softened into perspective, they sat together in quiet reflection, acknowledging how easily the story could have unfolded differently had assumptions replaced evidence, had fear overridden patience, had either of them chosen convenience over principle. The bracelet that once marked the narrowest point of Ethan's world remained tucked away, not forgotten, but integrated into their shared understanding, a symbol not of rescue or dependence, but of the moment both had chosen to remain present when retreat would have been easier. As time continued, their lives expanded beyond the roles that had first defined them, into shared commitments, into purpose shaped by mutual respect, into a future neither had planned but both had prepared for through action. And when they spoke of that chapter, they did so without embellishment, because the truth required none, a man relearning how to listen, a woman standing firm in her integrity, systems challenged and corrected, and a connection formed not through destiny, but through choice made again and again. In the end, what remained was not the mystery that had drawn attention, but the clarity that followed it, the understanding that healing was not a single moment of awakening, but a lifelong practice of alignment between values and behavior, and that love, when grounded in integrity, did not need to announce itself loudly to endure. And so their story settled into something quieter and stronger than it began, a testament to the idea that true transformation happens not when eyes open, but when people choose to see each other clearly and act accordingly, carrying that vision forward into every ordinary day that followed.